Everyone, please take your seats. Our program will resume shortly. Please take your seats.
We knew it would happen, but we have another conversation starting now, so thank you all. And I want to start the second panel. Well, let me first introduce you the amazing people that we brought here today, many of who have flown from Brazil just to be here with us today. So sitting right here next to me is Mauricio Valeixo. He's the director of the Brazilian Federal Police for investigations, and he has the easy job of investigating crimes like corruption and money laundering and drug trafficking and everything that's complicated in the world. This is the man that deals with it. So I'm not jealous of him, but I really admire your work. Then we have Patrick Stokes. Patrick used to be at the Department of Justice here, and he used to be the chief of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act unit. So he knows very well the topic of international cooperation on anti-corruption. And he's currently a partner at Gibson Dunn, a law firm here in Washington and throughout the United States, focusing on white-collar crimes. Alana Rizzo, I like to say, is a friend of mine and the best investigative journalist in Brazil currently in activity. Because if it was in the past, I could name myself. But currently, I think Alana is winning. And she's the director of the Brazilian Association of Investigative Journalism. And finally, we have Fernando Melo, who is a partner at Jota News, the partner of the Atlantic Council for this event and for a lot of our Brazil work here. He is also a researcher at UCLA, the University of California in Los Angeles, and a political analyst. And I'm actually going to start this conversation with him because we partnered with Jota to conduct an original survey of certain attitudes in the Brazilian Congress, not the public opinion, the congressmen, how are they operating in terms of the anti-corruption and the investigations that we're seeing in Brazil right now. So Fernando, why don't you kick off the conversation by showing these very interesting results?
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, everybody. As Andrea said, she asked me to bring some politics to the table. And I also want to start with an optimistic note on this long walk of Brazil towards accountability and the rule of law. Just to give an example, until 2001, no congressman could be investigated or prosecuted by Dr. Janot without authorization from the Congress. Needless to say, it never happened, right? And in 2001, the night they changed the Constitution and they changed this rule, it was unanimous. But a lot of politicians were really concerned about that. This is just one example. This guy was concerned what was going to happen with the politicians after this change. Actually, he was talking in the name of the then leader of the party, who later became the minister and was arrested a couple of weeks ago. So what about now, this political crisis and the car wash operation in Brazil? I think there are two main questions, and they are not mutually exclusive. Actually, a lot of politicians use these arguments that there were abuse or problems in the investigations in a way to try to harm the Lava Jato and to try to decrease this sort of accountability. We do these surveys monthly in the Congress. We did the last one last week, so these are pretty brand new results. We've asked the congressman if they think Temer will finish his term. 52%, almost 53% of them say yes last week. It's way lower than the 75, 73% a couple of months ago, but it's still higher than the number of votes necessary to take Temer out, for example. We've always asked for a couple of years now for the congressman to evaluate from 0 to 10 the relationship between the Congress itself and the government, now Temer. We have now pretty low percentage of high scores to a good relationship. They're keeping their scores in the middle there. But the interesting thing is that the highest percentage of high score for the relationship between the Congress and the President comes from the center. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with this group of parties. We call them the Big Center. It's a group of 10, 12 parties, non-ideological parties that historically they have been known to use to vote together, to organize together, to bargain with the government. And I think it's interesting, not a coincidence, that this group of non-ideological parties that bargain a lot have the highest percent of high scores to the relationship with Temer. They're bargaining now for pork barriers, positions in the government, and other things that I lead to the prosecutors to talk about. And let's go over the historical data here. With these scores from 0 to 10, the average score in the relationship with Temer now is 5.5. It's lower than it has been before. In the beginning of the year, it was almost 6. But if we compare with Rousseff, with Dilma Rousseff, before her impeachment, Temer is way higher, still way higher. Rousseff, the month before the impeachment, the score was around 3, pretty low, and remember this is the average. A lot of politicians gave 0 to the relationship with for Dilma and the Congress. There are also some that give 0 to Temer, but his average score is higher. So we have this political crisis and also the scores that this congressman give to the relationship between the Supreme Court is on average there. Of course, they're not that happy because the Supreme Court is investigating a lot of them. So they're not that happy with the relationship right now. This is one thing that I think it's important to look forward. Dr. Janot talked about how autonomous the prosecutor officer is in Brazil, and it's something that is unique in the world. But there is this project that is called the Abuse of Authority. There is a bill that would punish prosecutors and judges if they were found guilty of abusing their authority. And this is being discussed right now is like kind of a signaling that the politicians might be trying to get back to the investigators right now. It's pretty divided. We are going to keep looking into this to check the chance of approval of this bill. This is another thing that I think it's very important. We always talked about a political reform in Brazil to change the electoral system. Brazil has an crazy electoral system that has one of the most expensive campaigns in the world, huge districts. But this indicates right now that politicians are thinking about how to change the system to benefit themselves. That's what I think we need to pay attention right now, because depending on the political reform that we're going to approve, it might get things worse and then improve our political system. So going back to the two questions, what we are seeing now, we're still beginning to see some criticism to Lava Jato from important political scientists, lawyers, people from the civil society, which shows what exactly Dr. Janot said, that the civil society is controlling what the prosecutor is doing and on a daily basis. But it's also very important to pay attention to what the prosecutor of the Clean Hands in Italy said in a very recent interview last week. He is worried that it might happen in Brazil what happened in Italy, which is people start to change roles here and start to criticize the investigator themselves, saying, oh, they were doing abuse and these kind of things, instead of focus on the crime itself. I think the civil society, the press, academics, we need to pay attention to that in the following months. So I would go with 3 topics to look into in the next following months, politically speaking. This attempts to stop the operation coming from the political system. Another thing that I think is very important, especially looking into the 2018 election, is this idea that if the whole political system is corrupt, it paves way to an outsider who will claim that will drain the swamp.
Que vamos secar o pântano. Na América Latina temos esse
remember the drain the swamp, but especially in Brazil, we should pay attention to that for next year's election. The results of 70% of congressmen say that they think a political reform will be approved. I think it's very important, because the question is, what kind of change in the political system are they thinking about? They are talking about a lot of public money drained to campaigns next year, changing the electoral system, and I think we need to pay a lot of attention, because this might go to the wrong direction and actually decrease accountability in the country.
So
thank you, Andrea.
Thank you. That is an amazing survey that is very timely. It was just conducted, what, 2 weeks ago?
Last week. Yeah, last week.
So it really shows how the Brazilian Congress is seeing this operation and how it's looking into proceeding with the changes that we're trying to make in Brazil. And someone that's trying to make some of these changes is sitting here next to me. And we've talked a lot about how the Brazilian system has evolved into being able to prosecute and indict sitting presidents, former presidents, some of the biggest businessmen in the country, some of the biggest and most powerful senators and congressmen. There's really no one that has escaped so far, at least the prosecutory eye of the Brazilian justice system. So, Mr. Valeixo, my question to you, from the perspective of the federal police in Brazil, how did this shift occur? And I do know that for a long time now, we're seeing very technical and very good investigations happening, but for one reason or another, they didn't get anywhere in Brazil in the past. And now we're seeing them actually being pursued until their conclusion. So what happened?
Okay. Well, first, I'm sorry. I prefer to answer in Portuguese because I feel more comfortable. Bom,
What has changed? Initially, we have a massive investment in capacity building systems, IT, aim to provide the best tools possible to the investigation teams, and there has also been an increase in specialization among the units in every country, specialized in money laundering and embezzlement. And the greatest difference with regard to car wash was transparency. As we know, democracy, to preserve democratic values, it's important to have a free press and have transparency. Society began to follow closely everything that was happening, and this strengthened the investigation itself. This is a process, at least within the federal police, that began 15 years ago with investment in training and equipment, and also the culture in each individual federal police agent. He's there to serve the state, not a government.
Mr. Stokes, let me proceed with you. I know that there's only so much you can tell us about your time in the Department of Justice, but from what you can share with us, have you also seen the same type of evolution here in the United States in terms of the ability to prosecute these crimes, the ability to take investigations all the way through indictments and trials? And in terms of your cooperation with Brazil and with other countries in general, have you seen an evolution in the tools that you use for that?
No doubt. I think it's important to remember that the FCPA this year is 40 years old, and it's been a real evolution in how the FCPA has been used by U.S. authorities over time. Initially, there are very few prosecutions, and that's grown fairly dramatically over the years. There's learned experience that comes from prosecuting these cases. And so what I saw from my previous position working with law enforcement around the world, regulators around the world, is that different countries are in different spaces in terms of their development, in terms of their willpower to investigate, their resources, their technical experience, the tools, the prosecutorial tools, the investigative tools they have available to them. And you can see different countries arrayed on a spectrum. And I will say that, to jump to your point about Brazil, Brazil jumped, from my perspective, from sort of the beginning of that spectrum near to the end of that spectrum as quickly as any country I've seen. And it's I think, perhaps the most interesting anti-corruption story of the last 20 years. It's really quite dramatic what's going on both in Brazil and China, and I think less so in the United States, quite frankly, because the U.S. evolution has continued apace, and there's a lot of FCPA prosecutions. People see that, but the real developments have been in other countries, and Brazil has jumped to, I think, the front of the queue in terms of its willingness and its ability to not only bring cases on its own, but perhaps most importantly, work with other foreign authorities. So to me, the Operation Car Wash case is, I know today we're talking about the U.S. and Brazilian cooperation, but to me, the real story here is Brazil's willingness and ability and flexibility in working with countries around the world and coming up to speed with that, with a rapidity that's remarkable, that the United States didn't show, and I haven't seen any other country show, and that is sharing evidence informally, sharing evidence formally, putting the resources into it, and working with different systems, which can be quite complicated, and becoming adaptive with that, and then adapting their own system, which I saw, which was remarkable, which is again unusual. And all of that has allowed the Brazilian prosecutors and investigators to build cases much more rapidly and much more effectively than, frankly, you see with other countries. You see these types of investigations fall apart all the time on the inside. They're not made public, but as a prosecutor, I would see other countries, I would see the U.S. stumble, and I'd see other countries stumble. And certainly that will happen in Brazil as well. That's natural. But the willingness of the Brazilian prosecutors and investigators to work with U.S. authorities, work with Swiss authorities, work with Dutch authorities, work with Singapore authorities around the world, and share evidence informally is critical. The other piece that I think is highly unusual, I found with the Brazilian system and what's happening, is their willingness to use cooperators. Many countries are very reluctant to use cooperators. It doesn't fit well with their prosecutorial system.
You mean the plea bargains that we...
That's right.
Okay.
And I may have the facts here a little wrong, but as I understand it, that system, that tool was lifted from the U.S. system, and really for the first time in the Operation Car Wash has been applied broadly, has led the Brazilian law enforcement to develop a lot of cooperators in a way that's very customary in the U.S., how the U.S. builds cases, and the Brazilians seem to have adapted very quickly to using that model, which has allowed them to build these cases, and then the next step is share that evidence with other countries, and which has allowed other countries then to participate in these investigations and prosecutions, and so that you get something like this. You have the U.S. maybe focusing on a company, and Brazilian authorities focusing on individuals, and so both sides are getting prosecuted where that evidence may reside in Brazil. It's easier to go after individuals in Brazil, but the company may be in the U.S. or overseas, and so it's easier for U.S. authorities to go after the company. So that willingness to cooperate and share you see it happening in different ways with different countries, and with U.S. authorities cooperating with them, but there just really is nothing quite as, the scale of it is, you just don't see that happening anywhere else than what's happening with Operation Car Wash.
Yeah, I can only imagine. In Brazil, we're not new to corruption scandals, but even to us, this was surprising. The sheer scale of car wash operation and all the ramifications were quite surprising for Brazilians. And I know that this evolution has been happening, as you mentioned, for 10, 15 years, maybe 12 years. But did car wash operation give a push or a speed that we hadn't seen before? And if anything, what tools did it make mandatory for the police force to use, or different types of maybe conduct from the police force to prosecute these crimes?
Acho que ponto importante foi
An important point was the collaboration. It says plea bargain here. This created several paths for the investigation and sped it up. And information from plea bargain would be achieved, but it would take longer. So, especially when information are related to accounts abroad, and this sped up the investigation, and also the integration among institutions working together to combat corruption, and this allows us to improve the quality of the work that is provided to the justice system. There are institutions talking about the contributions from the tax side and corruption and embezzlement. It has several aspects, and I have to mention that car wash operation is the most well-known, but we have several other investigations that are much smaller, but this demonstrate that corruption is systemic and involved all Brazilian states.
The press was mentioned quite a few times here, and I've seen, as a former Brazilian journalist, I've seen compliments to how strongly and persistently we've covered this investigation, but I've also seen criticism saying how we've been kind of hostages to leakages that are controlled. So are we doing a good job in terms of investigating what's happening in Brazil and making it public?
I would say that the media in this specific case had a secondary role. Because of the amount of information and the quality of information the car wash operation had. And so I think journalists, we didn't do a lot of journalistic investigations. We had, car wash operation it's one of the big and the first operations that pretty much everything was public. Mm-hmm. So journalists had to read and analyze pretty much all the documents that were online. So we didn't have that much time to go after our own stories, no? So I think if we could say that there's a mistake, I think, or at least that we could encourage more, it's more investigative journalism, and we didn't do that much. But what we're seeing right now, it's also global cooperation in journalism. So there's a group of six countries, journalists from six countries working on stories together. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something that we need to encourage, that we didn't do in the beginning of the operation, because pretty much it's new for everyone. Also, it's new for the federal police. It's new for the prosecutors. It's also new for the journalists. So newsrooms were a little bit confused with the amount of information we're getting every day. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to encourage that. And the cooperation, you mean specifically on car wash or in car general? Wash? Yeah. Okay. There's a group of journalists working together. Like we're seeing that now. Like mm-hmm. people trying to get information from. Because as Renaud said, and as Ken Blanco said, and everybody's talking, like it was all over, especially in Latin America. So that's really interesting to see how journalists are trading information and trying to get, like sometimes you have a piece of the story and then the other guy from Argentina has the other piece, and then you just work together. That's something that we've never seen, and that's fantastic. Yes, it's amazing. Fernando, let me go back to you, because since we're talking about mistakes made as well, I know that you have
some concerns regarding the extent of the advances of the car wash operation in Brazil, and I'd like for you to share those concerns a little bit with us, because of course, in a new territory such as we are right now in Brazil, there's a lot to learn still. So.
Yeah, so just going back to those 2 points, and again, they're not mutually exclusive. I think that shows also the strength of civil society in Brazil and the press, and so the investigation is being overseen daily. I don't know how they could cope with that, but Dr. Valencia, it's daily people talking about that and pointing out possible mistakes, and I think that's only shown the strength of civil society in Brazil right now. There are a lot of people from different political groups and ideologically speaking that, oh, they're going after Lula, or they are going after only the president. And the extremes, I think we should disconsider, because the extremes are only seeing their own points. But I also think it's an important critical juncture that the investigation continues, but precisely and technically the way we are seeing until now. And I think the important point now is for the society to continue overseeing and not allowing any kind of abuse or any kind of proofs that are not strong as they should to get the Lava Jato going and get it to a final point.
So I'm going to get to questions from the audience in a sec, but before, I want to ask you all, what do you think is left to accomplish? We've done so much. What's still hindering our work in anti-corruption investigation? Where's the obstacle? What do we still need to overcome here?
Okay.
Well, I think that it's a process of that we've achieved a lot of results, but it's not going to be one institution that's going to overturn the situation in Brazil. I think the turning point is going to be in the hands of Brazilian society that's already been saturated with this problem, and it's going to be it's receiving all of this. It's been the victim of this corruption in terms of, or illustrated by bad schools, bad hospitals. So, if there's a change or not, Brazilian society is going to feel it. So, Brazilian society has to take responsibility to forge ahead and to make certain demands of its government.
What bothers you still? What do you want to see, solved so that you can proceed full force?
Well,
if you can pick one thing.
What we hope for, and I want to leave this clear here in terms of the difficulties that we face, it hasn't been an impediment for us, even though we don't have the guarantees, the proper guarantees that we should have. There's still a culture, an internal culture, that impedes certain investigations. I repeat, we don't have certain guarantees, because in the model of going after crime in Brazil, it represent the justice system, and it doesn't, for example, follow along the lines of what you have here in the United States. The police authority in Brazil has a certain autonomy, yes, and we follow along the lines of civil servants who are appointed to their positions through a civil service exam, but there are a lot of improvements that can still be made. And we can enjoy a lot more autonomy, especially financial autonomy.
We have amazing talent, especially in the federal police of Brazil. We still have to spread that around in terms of offering the means to attract the best talent, because it's right now you have to be a real idealist, I think, to be in the police force in Brazil. The compensation and the hardship that you face is quite significant. So I really admire the work that you guys do there. Mr. Stokes, what do you, from your perspective, what's the biggest obstacle, especially, let me say, in the cooperation with other countries? Because I'm sure not every country, like you mentioned, is like Brazil, that's super willing to cooperate and share information. And I'm sure you face, sometimes investigations that the other side is not as open, maybe?
Yeah, no, law enforcement is extremely territorial. I was a prosecutor for 18 years, and I spent most of my time refereeing fights between different law enforcement agencies, between, local, domestic, local, state, and federal domestic, as well as internationally. And that's the nature of it. So that's part of what's unusual in this case, is the degree to which there's cooperation so quickly. That was built up over years of relationships with Brazilian prosecutors and Brazilian police and U.S. authorities, but nonetheless, it developed quickly. I would say two things left to be done, and this is very high level, but first from an outsider's perspective, and that's all this is. I don't pretend to have any fine insights into Brazilian, local legal developments, but the big question people have is whether this is sustainable, whether this is a one-off or whether this is going to continue. The cynics would say, okay, great, prosecutors and police have stumbled upon great evidence in this case, and they may be able to, do prosecutions in this case, but is this really going to make for systemic change and political change and legal change and cultural change that's sustainable? That's the big question. And it would seem that it's moving in the right direction. It certainly is going in a great direction now, and so that's what people are waiting to see in the larger international anti-corruption community, is whether Brazil is going to continue to move in that direction, and the changes that are happening now are going to be cemented in a way that they'll continue for those next prosecutions down the road. That's the critical piece. Certainly, from a larger international standpoint, I think the big question is whether the lessons learned from the Operation Car Wash, cooperation with other authorities, the sharing of evidence, the working together with other authorities can also be learned. And many of the lessons are lessons that have been learned along the way in other investigations, but it's making sure that foreign authorities are working together cooperatively, not to double punish companies, not to unnecessarily investigate or step over each other in investigations, but being able to work in a way that's productive. And there are a lot of mechanisms and sort of technical, legal, and investigative points that go into this that we won't get bogged down in, but those lessons are important and will lead to more effective and efficient investigations, cross-border investigations in the future, because to state the obvious, companies doing legitimate business operate across borders very easily. People operating illegitimately can operate across borders very easily. Governments are terrible, law enforcement is terrible about working across borders because of the sovereignty issues and the local domestic law issues. And so there's real challenges in sharing it. So being able to adopt these lessons to apply to investigations in Asia, in Africa, throughout Latin America, throughout Eastern Europe and other places where there are a number of investigations going now where there isn't a lot of sharing of information. That's the real question, is can this be lifted to those other places and applied in the same way, because that makes these prosecutions far easier.
We would love to see the Brazilian corruption actually serving a great purpose of making everyone more cooperative.
Or at least the response to the corruption.
Exactly.
Yes.
Alana, your final words in terms of what's left to accomplish.
Yeah, I would say that for the media point of view, I think it's just keep on working, keep on investigating, and being the watchdog that we always have been, and I think it's also about engaging civil society. I think that's also really important. The media has a really important role in that. I think those are the two things that we as a journalist, we have to keep on working.
Yeah, what Alana hasn't said, well, she covered car wash operation personally for years in Brazil, and she can tell you how extremely tiring it is. There was so much information every day that sometimes the challenge is just to keep at it. But we are happy to see that a lot of Brazilian journalists are at it, including you, Alana, so thank you. Fernando.
I would say we need to tackle this crazy political system in Brazil. It's impossible to have 30 parties 28 parties in the Congress. If I'm not mistaken, this is the highest number of effective party in history, with exception of Yeltsin after the fall of communism. Of course, I'm worried about what type of reform they are thinking about. I don't overlook the capacity of Brazilian politicians to make things worse. But we're talking about huge districts with intra-party competition campaigns that cost billions of dollars, and this push to find money to these campaigns also. And so I think we need to tackle this issue of the political system in the country.
So let's move on to the final questions from the audience. I know that there's a lot of arms raised. Let's start here, second row. We're coming with a microphone to you. Please identify yourself and go ahead with your question.
Is it on? Thank you. Brazil, of course, has had its corruption problems ever since its origins. One thing I'm interested in, because of course I live in Brazil 6 months out of the year, so I followed various investigations, one being Mensalão. Okay. And I'm very interested in your opinion as to what happened to this Mensalão, because it started out and then suddenly nobody heard anything about it. So is this still an ongoing investigation, or is this finished, and what are the results?
We just missed your name?
Olga Hudasek.
Thank you.
Ok. O processo do...
The process was already concluded at the level of Supreme Court in Brazil because of the prerogative of form, and there have been many convictions, and what really marked that process is that many of those who were convicted and investigated in the Mensalão, and many who are in jail, continued to practice crimes in the area of corruption. And it was easy to demonstrate to society to what point we had gotten in the way of corruption. Well, the investigation was wrapped up, and many of those who were investigated were convicted, and many of them, in fact, were involved in car wash.
We're going to collect a few questions and answer them, but we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon, because I wish we could continue forever, but unfortunately we have to give this room to the next group. So let's take a couple questions here. There's one on the second row. So I'm going to collect 2 questions, okay? So please, sir, go ahead.
Yes. My name is Gustavo Palacio. I'm from Ecuador, and I belong to civil society movement. And of course, one of our main concerns is corruption in Ecuador. And my question is regarding Odebrecht list. And I want to be very specific, just as an example of how civil society can fight corruption, right? And probably you remember, I don't know, but Odebrecht was expelled by President Correa. I don't remember 2008, so about that year. But then Correa met with Lula, and this is a very important point, because I think they built a network with Chavez, Kirchner, and all of them. And I mentioned this point because Prosecutor Junot mentioned that there is an ethical, political, and economic crisis in Brazil. Mm-hmm. I believe, and that there is a regional problem. This is a regional problem that demands regional cooperation, mm-hmm. right? And I believe Ecuador is living an ethical, political, and economic crisis, terrible economic crisis. And of course, to fight corruption in Ecuador, we need cooperation. Mm-hmm. But what happens, this is also a general question, what happens when the government is under suspicion? The government is the heir of the Korea's, we call it the dictatorship. They have issues between the new president and Korea, there are differences between them. But the problem is that the prosecutor, Ecuadorian prosecutor, says they cannot release any information because Odebrecht doesn't want to give that to Ecuador, neither the office of the prosecutor. And the United States also have their rules. So, and they say they demand from us, in the case of Brazil, something that is that we cannot accept. They demand, for example, that we cannot sue the Odebrecht representative.
So the question is, what do you do with when the government is uncooperative, basically?
Yeah, it's corrupted or under suspicious or pressures or under pressure. But it's so important because we had elections, and history of Ecuador could have changed if we had had that information.
Let's get one more question before we turn to the panelists. The lady that just got up on this fourth row.
Hi, I'm Zoe Ryder with Transparency International, and I have a question for Mr. Stokes. Earlier today, the Assistant Attorney General spoke of the obvious importance of this international cooperation and in the FCPA and so forth, and how his division was never sort of interfered with politically, but of course budget priorities aren't in and of themselves political. So my question to you is, to what extent do you think we should all be concerned, we anti-corruption activists around the world, regarding the most recent budget for the Department of Justice, which I think gives a severe haircut to the criminal division and the prosecution of white-collar crime in the FCPA?
Great. Okay, so let's turn back to the panelists, and I'll let Mr. Stokes answer first, and I'll add a question to that, because in Brazil we are suffering similar budget cuts for investigations, and we recently at least changed the nature, closed the exclusive task force that we had in Curitiba to investigate car wash, or at least those were the news. So I would love to hear a little bit from Mr. Valeixo on that topic. But please, Mr. Stokes, you go first.
Sure. So, Ken, I agree with what Ken said. As a prosecutor for 18 years, I never had a political come to me and say, you must do X or Y in terms of a specific case. But certainly, you know, in the U.S. system, there are political appointees in each of the agencies, including the Department of Justice. So politics filters through. I mean, that's the reality, of course. It sets the agenda. When there's a different administration, a different agenda can come in, different priorities, different budget priorities, different resource priorities, different emphasis on what people are focusing on. The Trump administration has not appointed it hasn't gotten all of its nominees through the Senate, and the non-confirmation appointees haven't also been put in place. And so there's an open question on white-collar crime and FCPA enforcement in particular as to what the future will hold. And the early signs are from the professionals who are certainly working in the Department of Justice and the FBI and through the State Department and in other organizations that the professionals, the civil servants, will continue to do their jobs and focus on this. The big question is going to be, will there be a change in emphasis or resources? It's hard to say at this point. What I would say is that, you know, this isn't the first time that there have been budget cuts. There were budget freezes under the Obama administration, or at least congressionally imposed budget freezes. And so the Department of Justice and other law enforcement agencies are accustomed to working with fewer resources. What I would expect is that you're going to see fewer and fewer resources dedicated to white collar, more dedicated to violent crime, immigration, drugs, what have you. I think that's true as a general matter. I think what I would pay attention to at the fraud section with FCPA prosecution is an alternative funding stream you may have seen some news about. And there is a way that the fraud section, FBI and others have been able to tap into and receive funds through an alternative funding stream in order to fund operations. And there's been more and more scrutiny of that by the media as well as on the Hill, and whether they'll continue to be able to do that. There's nothing inappropriate in my mind about what the fraud section has done in the past, or the FBI, but it's being scrutinized, and that funding stream may be pulled back, and that would really hit their resources in a way more directly. The criminal division resources is what you're referring to. That can be parceled through the criminal division in different ways and may not affect the fraud section very much at all.
Okay, Mr. Valeixo.
With regard first to the issue of Ecuador, as he mentioned before, the solution is stronger institution protecting investigation teams, because there is a lot of pressure. It's natural, depending on how the investigation conducts the target of the investigation. It's natural. What is not regular is that this pressure to interfere with the investigation and with the team. So it is necessary to have strong institutions and protect investigation teams, because there comes a time where, depending on the evidence you can shed a light on, then the pressure no longer has any effect, because it gets to a point in the investigation where the assessment restricts interference, because the evidence is so clear that nothing can be done about that. So with regard to the changing strategies in Curitiba, the first person who asked me that was my mother. And what I said in the beginning is that there is autonomy among the investigation teams, and Lava Jato, from an administrative perspective, is conducted by the Paraná team. At one point, they decided to remove the investigation from a specialized unit that is called Delicar. It's a specialized division, and was taken to a higher level, and then it was put under the responsibility of a higher level people. So there was different. So they decided to do that in order to avoid interference. So something that happened recently is that transferring the team, they were linked to a state, to going back to where it all began, keeping all the team together with Lava Jato. And we also have investigations in those units that are conducted by other teams. And Car Wash has taken to a point where it's spread out throughout the countries. We have 17 units, and some of them are higher up. It's getting harder, especially in Rio and in Brasilia, with the issue of prerogative of forum. And there is another factor that we have to manage all these efforts that are being conducted everywhere in Brazil, and some of them have priority because of how the investigation is being conducted. But there has not been any intention of delaying or not giving priority to the work.
On Car Wash are tiny, no expectations at all. I want to thank all of you who stayed up until this hour in the afternoon to follow the event with us, and thank you so much to our panelists for coming here, Mr. Valesio for coming from Brazil just to talk to us today. So join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all for being here today.